Welcome to Noble Innovation, where we delve into the inspiring stories of remarkable individuals whose impact has changed the world for the better. Noble Innovation is a play on words for the Nobel Prize, as we begin with the series with those who have been honored the Nobel Prize. A major goal of this podcast is to inspire you to add more innovation to your life. We'll focus on the paradigm-shifting aspects of these impressive innovators and try to glean new ways of thinking about life that may help us devise new solutions to improve our world. I hope that you find that the innovative mindset is applicable to any endeavor, but perhaps you'll also learn a little bit about the specific content that each individual contributed to our world. So when I need a little bit of help or a little more expertise on diving into the specific subject matter of any of the innovators that we bring on our podcast, or maybe I'll interview innovators, I don't want to water down the content, and I want to be able to add a little bit more context to some of the innovations that these people have brought. So if you are a curious mind, or if you're eager to actually become more innovative, maybe that's building new project at work, or figuring out a way to spend your weekends creatively, or work on new project with your kids, I hope that you can find some ways of thinking about the world that can improve your life for the better. Now subscribe to Noble Innovation, and let's embark on a journey to put more innovation in your life. So now I'll dive into a quick story that is relevant to the innovator we'll talk about today, Otto Meyerhof. So if you're to see a picture of a world-class runner, a marathon runner, next to an Olympic weightlifting body or a bodybuilder, you'll see quite a different frame, even if they have the same body weight. You'll see some similarities and differences between these two people. They probably have a similar level of discipline. It takes a lot of hard work, sticking to a training regimen, optimizing your diet in order to become a high-performing athlete, for example. And they probably work out a similar amount. But you can imagine that their training regimens between the Olympic weightlifter and the marathon runner look very different. And that's intentional. They're trying to train different qualities. And if you were to look into the skeletal muscles, take a biopsy, look under the microscope at what's going on in there, you would see very different molecular machinery in each of them. And in general, the adaptations that the marathon runner has, if you look at sort of what's going on inside their muscles, you'll see they're optimized for long duration energy production. They need to be able to run for hours, unless you're fast enough to do it in under 2. They really want to be able to develop energy for a long, long time. And this requires the ability to utilize oxygen. So we talked about aerobic metabolism, or oxygen-containing metabolism, actually in the first episode of this with the Nobel Prize winner August Crowe, on how oxygen is actually delivered to skeletal muscles. And we didn't talk that much about other types of energy production. For example, what the weightlifter needs. They need to be able to produce energy very, very fast that can occur on the matter of milliseconds. So this is even faster than oxygen metabolism. Oxygen necessary metabolism can keep up with the demand that's imposed by a quick volume whole body muscular contraction, for example. We understand that there's two different energy systems, aerobic metabolism requiring oxygen and anaerobic metabolism in the absence of oxygen, because of the Nobel Prize winner Otto Meyerhof, who in 1922 was awarded the Nobel Prize for his discovery of the fixed relationship between the consumption of oxygen and the metabolism of lactic acid. Now let's figure out a little bit about who this guy is and how he become an innovator that was deemed worthy of winning a Nobel Prize, and also allows us to understand some of the molecular basis between the difference between an Olympic weightlifter, for example, or sprinter, and a marathon runner. So he was born in Hanover, Germany in the late 1800s and soon moved to Berlin. And when he was 16, he had kidney troubles that forced him to be bedbound for a long period of time. And I don't know what most kids in Germany did in high school or that age in the late 1800s, early 1900s, but being inactive and stuck at home probably wasn't that fun. That's a challenging situation for a high schooler. He ended up spending a lot of time with his mother, who taught him, that would read with him, write poetry with him. And it really makes me wonder if this was a crucial aspect of nurturing this sort of mental development, this period of reading and nurturing that with his mother, that maybe he turned this obstacle of getting sick into a positive, or at least he was able to yield a lot of benefits out of something that popped up unexpectedly in his life. So he goes on to medical school at the University of Heidelberg in 1909 and actually graduates with his MD thesis in psychiatry. And he published a book on the psychological theories of mental disturbances. And for someone who's getting a Nobel Prize on skeletal muscle energy metabolism, this might seem a little odd. Interesting to me, I'm actually, as I apply into psychiatry with a background in molecular metabolism, I feel like I can relate to this guy a little bit. And I think that maybe he's seeing that the way of thinking about why something came to be, sort of this philosophical, psychological understanding of what's going on, the purpose of things and deriving meaning from different situations, I think is helping him with his sort of scientific mindset. So I'm wondering if his thinking deeply about psychiatry, the human mind, and interactions between people helped him think about the interactions between molecules and skeletal muscles. So he's probably approaching problems at first principles. So what is the earliest cause and perhaps the meaning of what's going on? And then he had this fateful encounter after his medical degree. He was working as an intern just in a general medical clinic. He met Otto Warburg, who's a future Nobel Prize winner at that time. So neither of them have a Nobel Prize, but they meet there. It's seems like probably their first job out of medical school. And this guy is one of the more impressive biochemists of all time. And so what kind of chance encounter they have where, Otto Warburg probably at some point said to Otto Meyerhof, hey, psychiatry is very, very cool, but have you checked out biochemistry? And so they end up working together in the laboratory for years together on things like bacterial metabolism. But I imagine that there's a crucial component here that I think is probably essential to a lot of innovation. He found a confidant with whom he worked with for years, who he could have discussions about concepts that might have been bashed by other popular thought at that time. They could actually talk about discoveries and concepts that were not popularly understood at that time, even at the deepest level. So I think in general, if you can find a partner or a group of people that are able to sort of push the boundaries of what we currently understand, that might be one of the pieces. So whether that's your partner, it could be your partner at work, it could be a teammate, it could be a colleague. It seems like finding a confidant that you can actually ask questions that might go against status quo or that might border the boundary of our current understanding. I imagine that's what Otto Warburg was to Otto Meyerhof at this time. So after working some time in the laboratory, he started to really wonder, how exactly is the food that we eat turned into heat? So we eat food, some metabolic process probably happens, and then we release this energy as heat. So that was relatively well understood. But all of the stuff that's going on in the middle, there wasn't really a great understanding of how that happens. And so I'll try to paint the picture of one of the major innovations that Otto Meyerhof did with an illustration. So say you ride the train every morning for, say it's $3 a day to get from Washington, D.C. to Bethesda to the NIH. So that's a train commute that I used to do when I worked at the National Institutes of Health. We ran clinical trials, and so there would be patients on the inpatient unit that you would have to be there, every day in order to do the lab measurements and things like that. So I would take the train, and let's say it was, $3 a day. The train malfunctions, or there's a snowstorm, for example, which happened one time when I was there, but you had to go in to see that patient, or say you have an important meeting with your supervisor. So what do? You actually start rushing because you didn't plan for this. So you call an Uber, which takes the same, maybe a little bit faster, around the same amount of time, but you go the exact same distance from your house to work. But after tax and tip, it's $38. You did the same amount of work, the same exact job, but one method of getting there cost you 12 times the amount. This trip to work, when you fueled it by Uber, was 12 times as much. In the absence of the ability to take public transit, it costs way more to do the same job. So I've said that like 5 times now. But what I mean is, this concept illustrates 2 types of metabolism: aerobic versus anaerobic energy metabolism. Aerobic metabolism which means using oxygen to perform certain functions, is sort of like riding the train. It's inexpensive, it's energy efficient, and you get a lot more bang for your buck. But in the setting of increased demand or urgency, you might have to tap into your body's ability to perform anaerobic metabolism. So this is converting food to energy in the absence of oxygen. So in the presence of oxygen, your glucose goes a long way. If you're not in a rush, you're able to metabolize your glucose in the mitochondria. That's where where aerobic energy metabolism happens. That's where ATP is produced in the mitochondria. But in the absence of oxygen, you have to find other ways to create that energy. And actually, in the setting of Otto Warburg, I'll describe one of the experiments that he did in frog muscle. He noticed that as soon as you restrict the skeletal muscle from seeing any oxygen, so he put the muscle inside a chamber that only contains nitrogen, which is normally 75% or so of normal air. And with no oxygen at all, he saw that the glycogen, so glycogen is how we store carbohydrates in our muscle. Glycogen is a long branched linkage of carbohydrates or sugar molecules. So tons of sugar molecules. When we eat carbohydrates or when you carbo load before a race, that's in order to increase glycogen storage in your skeletal muscle and your liver. Most glycogen in our body is stored in our skeletal muscle, but if you do on a per gram basis, our liver is actually where the majority of our skeletal muscle, where the majority of our glycogen is stored. Either way, we know that glycogen storage in skeletal muscle now is an important energy reserve, especially for exercise, especially before a race or something like that, because of this concept. So when there's no oxygen, Otto Meyerhof realized that all of the glycogen turned to lactate. So you've heard of lactic acid or lactate. His experience demonstrated that in a frog muscle, all of the glycogen was metabolized to lactate when there was no oxygen. And as soon as he restored oxygen content, he saw that the lactate went back to glycogen. So this is actually a real controversy. But first, I'll just comment. This was the first description of a metabolic cycle that's happening in any metabolic biochemical process. Glycogen to lactate, lactate back to glycogen. And conceptually, what this means is we store energy in the form of glycogen, and when we need to do work or even just survive, all of our muscles, all of our body, even when we're doing nothing, we're just sitting in the resting state, is burning calories just to support normal metabolic processes. So even if you were to do nothing, you're going to burn a certain number of calories every single day. That's your resting metabolic rate. So normally we prefer to use oxygen because it's a lot more energy efficient. It's like taking public transit. But glycogen is one of the molecules that, when broken down into glucose, can go through glycolysis. So glycolysis is a process that Otto Meyerhof started to begin understanding some of the enzymes, some of the machinery in. But after glucose goes to pyruvate, it can be converted to lactate through lactate dehydrogenase. And lactate is a very popular molecule that you hear about, especially in relation to lactate threshold. So when you start having to tap into anaerobic metabolism is when you start demanding energy so much that you have to tap into the anaerobic metabolism system, and lactate is a byproduct of generating ATP. And so I'll just touch briefly on this. If you want to hear more about it, let me know. This concept of lactate going back to glycogen and skeletal muscle has not really been borne out. We understand that lactate goes to the liver, which is the main gluconeogenic organ, along with the kidney and perhaps intestinal cells. Lactate can be converted to glucose in the liver. But these authors, so this is something that is still a controversy today, that are fast twitch skeletal muscles versus slow twitch able to actually convert lactate back to glycogen. It's not really understood. There's a series of papers in 1956 that showed that it was possible in rats without a liver. In 1979, a pretty famous exercise physiologist, John Hollizy, showed that It is possible to convert lactate back to glycogen in fast twitch but not slow twitch muscles. So this is a little too sciencey. It's getting away from the major concepts. But all this is to say, Otto Meyerhof began to realize at a molecular level what was actually happening to differentiate two different types of metabolism: efficient energy metabolism, or aerobic, and inefficient, an alternative pathway in the absence of oxygen, or an emergency anaerobic metabolic system. And through this, for the first time, he demonstrated a metabolic cycle and also the flexibility of our metabolic system. This is a concept that I think is so interesting. How is it that no matter what diet we have, people can fast for a long period of time, we live? This just shows that our body has this incredible capacity for metabolic flexibility, and there's numerous pathways to get energy when we need it. So I think this is a really exciting concept to me, metabolic flexibility, and I would love to talk about that in another setting. But before I get into any deeper into the science, we'll just take a step back and say, this is something that, people were actually working on at the time. So in terms of the innovative nature of this, I think it's simply that Otto Meyerhof wasn't satisfied with the general understanding that our food is ultimately converted to energy and allows us to do things. I think that conceptually, he took a step back and wondered what is actually happening. So if you imagine yourself in a scenario, say you're facing a problem at work and you've had like 5 meetings in a row about this over the course of weeks, and everybody's been working on the same problem, you might want to just take a step back and think, what are the pieces of this problem that's going on? And which components do we not yet understand to help us solve this problem? So I think that's the major innovative piece of this, is that sometimes you need to take a step back, think about the big picture, and connect the dots. And that's what Meyerhof did. He still didn't explain yet how food was converted into work. He just showed that there's two different processes that sort of happen and that's the reason that he won the Nobel Prize, actually. In my opinion, perhaps more impressive discovery and more exciting discovery is the discovery of ATP that was done by some people in Meyerhof's laboratory. So adenosine triphosphate, or ATP, is the universal energy currency in our body. So this actually is the substrate that that helps us produce almost all of our work. There's other ways, just like there's the dollar, there's cryptocurrency, there's different ways to pay for things. ATP is one of the most, universal ways to use to pay for the ability to do work or to perform different functions. So ATP is adenosine triphosphate. There's 3 phosphates. When you remove a phosphate to make ADP, adenosine diphosphate, the breaking of that bond, when you pair it with another function, can actually supply the energy to do that work. So breaking that last bond of an ATP molecule, when paired with, say, performing a chemical conversion, right? You can do a conversion if you use ATP, for example. You break the bond. You can also do that with other molecules, but ATP is sort of the dollar that you would use when you go to the store. So you go to it would be really annoying if you had to, if you wanted to pay for a car, you had to use a specific type of currency. If you wanted to pay for your milk, you would use a different type of currency. The dollar serves a purpose as being useful in order to perform different settings in different settings. That's what ATP is in our body. And now we'll bring it back to the commute to work. And now he has a better understanding of the scientific basis. If you use glucose using only anaerobic metabolism, you only get 3 molecules of ATP. And so that same molecule of glucose, if you use oxidative metabolism using aerobic energy metabolism, you can get 38 molecules of ATP. It's way more efficient. And so this number is debated. I use Solway's Metabolism at a Glance. I think it's a great textbook. But the point is, if you want to pay for your commute to work, it's like the difference between running and biking, right? Running 10 miles is going to cost you way more energy than biking 10 miles. And so this is just, in general, there's two different ways, and ATP is the basis of it. I'll take a step back and just reiterate, a lot of scientists were working on this at the time, and it doesn't seem like much of the field was surprised by this finding. It was impressive, no doubt, but how was he able to be the innovator that gets credit for this discovery? There could be some politics that I'm not sure about, that might be stuff that happens in general. I don't think that's implicated here, but I think he was in the right place at the right time. He had a good team member, so it was actually, I don't know if it was a graduate student or a postdoc in his lab that discovered ATP, but they were also able to execute. And so that's all the science that I'm going to talk about today. Sometimes I'll go a little deeper. I would love to hear if you think that I should take a step back, or if you like the details and I actually should give more details so I can explain a little bit better. I think it might be a little bit better if I had slides and maybe have this as a different sort of module that would accompany this. But just let me know. I love feedback. So I'll talk about some of the qualities that probably facilitated his success. So these are things that I think that we can train. I think that these are things that I might try to practice and think about how I can incorporate in my life. So that I'm not listening to music or a podcast at a time and you just think idly. He maintained this theoretical framework throughout his life, sort of beginning with philosophy, psychology, and the mind. So in his settings, he probably began to approach things as, what is the meaning of this? Why would this be happening? So the sort of questions that you might ask in a patient that you see in a psychiatric setting. How is this happening? What is going on? And I think to this sort of questioning and trying to understand, get a grip with something that he used in multiple domains of his life. Another quality was this chance encounter with a great colleague, Otto Warburg. He might not have ever gone into biochemistry or gone into studying this at all if it weren't for having met this guy. He might have gone on and been a great psychiatrist and saw many patients and helped a lot of people, but he never would have been able to help us understand why a marathon runner looks different and trains differently than a weightlifter. So if it weren't for Otto Warburg and having this individual, like I said, that you can explore the edges of your understanding with, he might not have gotten to where he was today. So just something to keep in mind when you find somebody, whether it seems by chance, that you see that you can interact with on a sort of an uninhibited basis, maybe that's a relationship that you should nurture. And the final thing that he had was that he had this desire to understand things more fully. So like I said, many people were working on this, but his desire to understand the molecular basis of how this all happened is what allowed him to go beyond the surface level and make some discoveries. So as far as some of the real-world implications of this work today, I think that it's really interesting that these findings is really the basis, for example, of how we understand how long organs might be able to survive in preparation for transplant. So different organs have different capacities for aerobic and anaerobic metabolism. So the brain, for example, really is extremely reliant on oxygen-mediated metabolism. The brain, in the absence of oxygen, can only last seconds, without having some neurons begin to die off. And so this is the concept of, if you get a stroke, you get a blood clot, for example, that blocks a certain part of your brain that constricts blood and oxygen from actually getting to that area. There's only so much ATP there that you can get in order to maintain the cellular functions at that time. And so this is a concept that, is different for liver transplants or kidney transplants. So I'd have to ask an expert on how long they actually think that these organs can survive without oxygen, but it's something that we pay attention to and understand as a molecular basis for organ transplant. And also just the different types of exercise training. So coaches are now able to optimize their energy production systems in order to create programs that are better for marathon running or better for sprinting. And I think CrossFit actually is an interesting example where there's not as much science on it, at least, in peer-reviewed journals right now. But we're beginning to see an exciting experiment that combines two different types of training, or multiple types of training actually, in order to optimize these different energy systems. So I actually don't know how that fits into the context of these basic findings, but it's an interesting concept to watch unravel. And so I will finish with some lessons that I gleaned from Otto Meyerhof. And the first one is find a team with whom you can explore the edges of understanding. And what I mean by this also is just find somebody that you can talk about stuff that isn't the status quo. If you have ideas and concepts, it's very hard to sometimes go against the grain, especially if you're met with resistance. If you can find somebody that you can talk about ideas that you have that might not be traditional, but it's your view of the world, these are some of the relationships that you should nurture. And it involves a great deal of trust, and it might be just the way for you to come up with new ideas and new thoughts that can improve your life. So find a team with whom you can explore the edges of our understanding. And also one thing that I didn't get into that much, but in his biography, he made a lot of his fundamental discoveries very much prior to having excellent working conditions. So this is another thing that August Crow in the first episode was really, really good at. He was an innovator because he was resourceful. He was able to work on problems without having a lot of stuff, basically a lot of funding, a lot of support. And so this is something that you should think is maybe if you don't have everything that you think you need, the better idea is to just begin going. So make that plan to do that trip and you'll figure out how to get there. Or say there's a solution that you want to solve that you don't have all the pieces in mind. There's a balance, right? And another lesson that I think is great that I practice, especially as I'm working on this podcast, perfect is the enemy of great. And it inspires me to make sure that I begin putting out content bi-weekly. That's my goal. And I know it's not perfect. That's why I'd love to hear feedback. And I would just get a little bit better every time. So even if you don't have the ideal setup and all the right equipment, before you have excellent working conditions, just go on and begin. And other things is also that metabolism, like many things in life, is cyclic in nature. For example, we have a ton of different pathways that are interconnected with each other. And depending on our current environment, for example, if it's oxygen rich or oxygen poor, we will find ways to get it done. Sometimes it'll cost you a lot more energy or effort or money, but there are possibilities. So this is a nice principle that I think shows that our ability to get things done and the flexibility depending on our situation is applicable to our biochemistry, it's applicable to our metabolism, but it's also something that's applicable to life. And a final thing that I think might have been illustrated well by Otto Meyerhof is to stay philosophical. And what I mean by this is ask big questions. It's easy to accept assumptions, but it's a lot harder to question them and even harder to come up with solutions when you find a problem. So herein lies the importance of finding people that you can discuss anything with. So that's all that I have for today. I would love some feedback. I didn't get too deep into the science because I really want to focus more on the lessons and the principles that these innovators actually display in order to have done great work. So let me know what you think, and I would love to hear more. Now go innovate.